They say perfection is a shield. If you plan every detail, if you control every outcome, nothing can hurt you. Lady Eleanor Sterling believed that. She had the perfect dress, the perfect venue, and the perfect fiancé, the Duke of Blackwood. But perfection is fragile. It's like glass, beautiful until it shatters. Just 48 hours before the ceremony that would make her a duchess, Eleanor opened the heavy oak doors of her father's library and saw the one thing not written in her wedding planner. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a conspiracy, and it was happening between the man she loved and the cousin she trusted with her life. What happens when the perfect bride decides to stop crying and start plotting? This isn't a love story. This is a story of revenge. The ink on the seating chart was still wet. Lady Eleanor Sterling blew on the parchment gently, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was October 14th, 1889. Outside the high windows of Sterling Manor, the autumn leaves were turning a violent shade of crimson, mirroring the velvet drapes being hung in the great hall. "Move the Earl of Holloway 2 seats away from the bishop," Eleanor instructed, not looking up from her desk. "If they discuss tithes before the soup course, there will be a duel." "As you wish, my lady," the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, said, marking the change with a trembling hand. Mrs. Gable had served the Sterling family for 30 years, and she had never seen a bride so composed, so militaristic in her precision. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. She was 22, possessed of a sharp intelligence that society often mistook for coldness. She wasn't cold. She was careful. Her father, the Earl of Sterling, had been failing in health for years, his mind drifting like fog. Eleanor had run the estate since she was 18. This wedding to Arthur, the Duke of Blackwood, was the capstone of her efforts. It was a union that would secure the Sterling legacy for another century. Arthur was handsome in the way statues are handsome, chiseled, imposing, and utterly unreadable. He was the catch of the season, and he was hers. "Where is Beatrice?" Eleanor asked, turning back to the room. "Your cousin is in the library, I believe," Mrs. Gable replied. "She said she was looking for a book of poetry to read at the reception." Eleanor smiled softly. "Beatrice, her orphan cousin, taken in by Eleanor's father 10 years ago." Beatrice was everything Eleanor was not: soft, blonde, prone to tears, and endlessly helpless. Eleanor had protected her, dressed her, and even promised her a cottage on the estate grounds after the wedding. "I should go check on her," Eleanor said, smoothing the lace on her bodice. "She gets nervous around the Duke. I don't want her hiding in the stacks all evening." The hallway was quiet, the servants busy in the kitchens preparing for the arrival of the first guests. The air smelled of beeswax and expensive lilies, 5,000 of them, imported from France at Arthur's request. Eleanor reached the heavy oak doors of the library. It was her sanctuary, the place where she kept the estate ledgers, the place where she had taught herself forensic accounting to save her father from ruin. She reached for the brass handle, intending to swing it open and greet her cousin. But the handle was stiff. Locked? No, just caught. Then she heard the sound. It was a low, guttural moan, not of pain, but of stifled pleasure. Eleanor froze. Her hand hovered over the brass. A logical mind immediately searches for a logical explanation. Perhaps a maid and a footman had snuck in. She prepared to be stern, to dismiss them for their impropriety. She pushed the door open just an inch. The hinges, usually well oiled, gave a tiny squeak, but the sound was drowned out by a voice. "Stop worrying, you little fool." It was Arthur. His voice wasn't the polished baritone he used at dinner parties. It was rough, arrogant. "But she's meticulous, Arthur. She counts every penny," a woman's voice whispered back. "Beatrice." If she sees the transfer documents before the wedding, she won't, Arthur snapped. Through the crack in the door, Eleanor's world tilted on its axis. She saw them. They were standing by the fireplace, the glow of the embers casting long, dancing shadows on the Persian rug. Beatrice was pressed against the mahogany mantel, her hands gripping Arthur's lapels. Arthur, her Arthur, was devouring her neck, his hands roaming over the cousin Eleanor had clothed and fed. "Once the vows are said on Saturday," Arthur murmured against Beatrice's skin, "the Sterling estate becomes my property under the Marital Rights Act. I'll sign the eviction notice for the Earl the next morning. We'll put him in an asylum in Yorkshire. He won't last a winter." Eleanor stopped breathing. The betrayal of the body, the kiss, was a knife to the heart. But what Arthur had just said? That was a knife to the throat. "And Eleanor?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling, though she leaned into his touch. "What will you do with her?" Arthur laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. "Eleanor is a boring, frigid accountant in a silk dress. She'll produce an heir, and then I'll send her to the Dowager House in Cornwall. She can count seagulls for the rest of her life. You and I, Beatrice, we'll have the manor, we'll have the money, we'll have everything." Beatrice giggled. "She thinks you love her. She thinks she organized the perfect wedding." "She organized her own funeral," Arthur sneered. Then he grabbed Beatrice's face and kissed her, deep, possessive, and mocking. Eleanor slowly, agonizingly, pulled the door closed. She didn't scream. She didn't burst in and slap them. That was what a hysterical woman would do. That was what a weak woman would do. Eleanor Sterling backed away from the door, her satin slippers silent on the floorboards. She walked backward until she hit the wall of the corridor. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But her mind, her sharp, analytical mind, suddenly went ice cold. Eviction notice, asylum, Cornwall. They weren't just cheating on her. They were planning to dismantle her entire existence. Arthur didn't have money. She knew the Blackwood estate was land-rich, but cash-poor. He was marrying her to liquidate the Sterling assets to pay his own debts. And Beatrice? Beatrice was the inside man. Eleanor looked at her reflection in a hallway mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "No," she whispered to the glass. She straightened her spine. She smoothed her hair. She had organized a wedding for 400 guests, coordinated logistics for 3 different rail lines, and managed an estate with 50 staff members. If Arthur thought she was just a boring accountant, he was about to learn a very painful lesson. He wanted the Sterling estate. He was going to get it. But not the way he thought. Eleanor turned and walked toward her study. She didn't need a handkerchief. She needed her lawyer. The dinner bell rang at 8:00 p.m. sharp. The dining room was a masterpiece of candlelight and crystal. Eleanor sat at the foot of the table, her father, the Earl, asleep in his wheelchair at the head. To her right sat Arthur, looking dashing in his evening wear. To her left sat Beatrice, wearing a necklace of pearls that Eleanor had given her for her last birthday. "The pheasant is excellent, Eleanor," Arthur said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "You truly have a gift for domestic management." "I aim to please," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, glass smooth. She took a sip of wine. "I was just telling Beatrice earlier how important trust is in a marriage. Don't you agree, Arthur?" Arthur didn't blink. "Paramount, my dear. Without trust, we are nothing." Beatrice choked slightly on her wine. "Oh, excuse me," she coughed, her eyes darting to Arthur. "Careful, cousin," Eleanor said, staring directly at her. "Swallowing things you shouldn't can be dangerous." The double meaning hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. But neither Arthur nor Beatrice caught it. They were too arrogant to believe Eleanor was capable of suspicion. "Arthur," Eleanor continued, cutting a piece of meat with surgical precision, "I was reviewing the marriage settlements today. There is a small clause regarding the dower portion. My solicitor, Mr. Thaddeus Thorne, suggested we review it one last time before the ceremony." Arthur's hand tightened around his fork. "Thorne, I thought we agreed that my solicitors handled the final draft. There is no need to involve old Thorne. He's antiquated." "He is thorough," Eleanor corrected. "He will be joining us for breakfast tomorrow, just to sign the final addendums." Arthur exchanged a quick, panicked glance with Beatrice. "Tomorrow." "But tomorrow is the hunt. I have guests arriving." "It will only take a moment," Eleanor smiled. It was a terrifying smile, devoid of warmth. "Unless there is something in the contract you wish to change?" "No," Arthur said quickly. "No, of course not. Whatever makes you happy, my love." "My love." The words made Eleanor's skin crawl. Later that night, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat in her study, surrounded by ledgers. She had summoned Mr. Thorne via a rider sent out 2 hours ago. While she waited, she dug into the Blackwood financials. Accessing another nobleman's private finances was impossible for most, but Eleanor knew how to read the gaps in public records. She looked at the tax filings for Arthur's estate in Northumberland. "Empty," she whispered, tracing the columns of figures. "He hasn't paid land tax in 3 years." She pulled out another file. A letter from a bank in London, addressed to her father, but intercepted by Beatrice months ago. Eleanor had found it hidden in Beatrice's vanity while the girl was bathing before dinner. It was a foreclosure warning. Not for Arthur, for Sterling Manor. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father had signed as a guarantor for a loan Arthur took out 6 months ago. Beatrice had guided the Earl's shaking hand, telling him it was for Eleanor's wedding present. They aren't waiting until after the wedding, Eleanor realized, her blood running cold. They already own half of it. The wedding is just to stop me from suing them. A knock came at the window. Not the door, the French doors leading to the garden. Eleanor startled, reaching for the letter opener, the only weapon she had. She moved to the curtains and peered out. A figure stood in the rain, a man in a dark coat, holding a leather satchel. It was Mr. Thorne, but he wasn't alone. Standing behind him, looking wet and thoroughly annoyed, was a man Eleanor recognized from the society papers, though they had never met. It was Lord Silas Blackwood, Arthur's estranged younger brother, the black sheep of the family who had been disowned for becoming a barrister instead of a soldier. Eleanor unlocked the doors. "Mr. Thorne, and Lord Silas." Silas stepped in, shaking the rain from his coat. He was darker than Arthur, with eyes that were sharp, cynical, and tired. "Lady Eleanor," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Thorne told me you might be walking into a trap. I told him he was wrong." Eleanor bristled. "Excuse me?" Silas looked at her, his eyes scanning the ledgers on her desk. "I told him you weren't walking into a trap. I told him you were already in the jaw of the wolf. The question is, are you ready to cut your way out?" "Arthur plans to commit my father to an asylum," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with rage. "And he is sleeping with my cousin." Silas didn't look, surprised. "That sounds like Arthur. He lacks imagination, but he makes up for it in cruelty." "Why are you here?" Eleanor asked. "Because," Silas pulled a document from his coat, "Arthur owes me £50,000, and if he marries you and liquidates your estate, he'll have the money to pay me off and make me disappear. I'd prefer he didn't." "So we are allies of convenience," Eleanor stated. "The best kind," Silas grinned crookedly. "Now, show me what you found." For the next 4 hours, the three of them, the bride, the lawyer, and the black sheep, constructed a counter-offensive. "The wedding must go on," Silas said, pouring himself a brandy. "What?" Eleanor cried. "I cannot marry him." "You won't marry him," Silas corrected, "but the ceremony must happen. The guests must be there. The priest must be there. Because Arthur needs to sign the final register in front of witnesses to claim the dower rights. That is the moment." "The moment for what?" Eleanor asked. Silas looked at the foreclosure letter in Eleanor's hand. "The moment we switch the contracts. You need to humiliate him, Eleanor. You need to destroy his reputation so thoroughly that no bank in London will ever lend him a farthing again. If you just cancel the wedding, he spins the story. He says you're insane, like your father. He uses the power of attorney Beatrice tricked your father into signing. He wins." Eleanor looked at the fire. She thought of Arthur's laugh in the library. She thought of Beatrice's betrayal. "A public execution," Eleanor whispered. "Socially speaking, yes," Thorne nodded gravely. "I need to act the part," Eleanor said, standing up. "For 2 more days I have to be the blushing bride." "Can you do it?" Silas asked, watching her closely. "He is charming. He is manipulative. He will try to get you into his bed to ensure you are docile." Eleanor looked at Silas. Her eyes were dry, hard diamonds. "Lord Silas," she said softly, "I have organized this wedding down to the second. I chose the wine, the flowers, the hymns, and the linens. I assure you, I can organize a deception." The clock struck 3 a.m. The war had officially begun. The next morning, the hunt began. But the prey wasn't a fox. Eleanor came down to breakfast, wearing a bright yellow dress, looking radiant. Arthur was nursing a hangover, and Beatrice looked pale. "Good morning, my love," Eleanor chirped, kissing Arthur on the cheek. She forced herself not to recoil at the smell of his cologne, the same cologne that had lingered in the library. "Beatrice, darling, you look tired. Didn't sleep well?" I had bad dreams," Beatrice stammered. "Oh, poor dear," Eleanor soothed, pouring her a cup of tea. "Don't worry. In 2 days, everything will change. I have a special surprise for you at the reception, Beatrice. A gift to thank you for all your loyalty." Beatrice smiled, relief washing over her face. She thought it was the cottage deed. "And Arthur," Eleanor turned to him. "Mr. Thorne is in the study. He has the papers. Shall we go sign them? I want to make sure the estate is secure." Arthur stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Lead the way, Eleanor. Let's get it over with." As they walked down the hall, Eleanor caught Silas's eye. He was standing in the shadows of the vestibule, disguised as a clerk. He gave her a barely perceptible nod. The trap was set. But traps have a nasty habit of snapping shut on the wrong person if one isn't careful. And Eleanor didn't know that Beatrice had one more secret, one that wasn't in the ledgers. The study smelled of old paper and the stale smoke of Arthur's cigar. Mr. Thorne sat behind the desk, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, looking every bit the dusty, harmless solicitor Arthur believed him to be. In the corner, ostensibly organizing files, stood Silas, his back turned, his shoulders hunched in the guise of a lowly clerk. "This is merely a formality, Your Grace," Thorne wheezed, pushing a stack of parchment toward Arthur. "The Sterling estate entailment requires the groom to acknowledge the existing debts, of which there are none, naturally, and to sign the stewardship agreement." Arthur didn't even read the first page. He picked up the quill, dipped it in the inkwell, and looked at Eleanor. "You worry too much, my dear. I am happy to take the burden of stewardship off your hands. You should be worrying about embroidery and whatever it is duchesses do." Eleanor forced a smile. It felt like a mask of clay cracking on her face. "I just want to ensure my father's legacy is preserved, Arthur." "It will be preserved," Arthur said, signing his name with a flourish. "Arthur Frederick Blackwood. It will be in the best of hands." Eleanor watched the nib of the pen scratch against the paper. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. Arthur believed he was signing a standard stewardship agreement that, combined with the marriage vows, would grant him full power of attorney over the Sterling assets immediately upon the pronouncement of husband and wife. He was wrong. Silas had spent the night forging a duplicate document. The preamble was identical. The font was identical. But the clause on page 3, the page Arthur had just flipped past without glancing at, was vastly different. Arthur wasn't signing for stewardship. He was signing a deed of gift, irrevocably transferring his own unmortgaged assets, specifically his family's ancestral hunting grounds in Scotland, the only thing of value he had left, into a blind trust for the benefit of the future issue of the Sterling line. And the trustee? Lord Silas Blackwood. "There," Arthur said, blotting the page. "Done. Are you happy now, Eleanor?" "Ecstatic," Eleanor said, her voice dropping an octave. "You have no idea how much this means to me. Now, if you'll excuse me," Arthur checked his pocket watch. "I have a tailor coming to the guest house. Apparently my waistcoat needs taking in. One must look one's best for the photographers." He strode out of the room, the floorboards groaning under his arrogance. As soon as the door clicked shut, the room exhaled. Silas turned around, straightening his posture. He walked to the desk, picked up the document, and blew on the ink. "He didn't even read the indemnity clause," Silas said, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's not just greedy, Eleanor. He's lazy. That is a dangerous combination." "He thinks he's untouchable," Eleanor said, leaning against the bookshelf for support. Her knees felt weak. "He thinks I am a naive girl who is lucky to be chosen." "He signed away the Scottish lands," Thorne chuckled darkly. "If the wedding proceeds and this document is filed, he will be destitute within the week." "But we aren't just making him destitute," Eleanor said, her eyes hardening. "We are exposing him. Is everything ready for the ceremony?" "The slide projector is being installed in the choir loft as we speak," Silas said. "Technically, it is for the hymn lyrics, so the congregation can sing along. A modern touch." "A modern touch indeed," Eleanor murmured. Just then, the door handle rattled. Silas dove back into the corner, grabbing a stack of files. Eleanor stiffened. The door opened, and Beatrice slipped inside. She wasn't wearing her usual pastels. She was in a dark riding habit, her face flushed. "Oh," Beatrice stopped, looking from Eleanor to Thorne. I thought Arthur was here. He just left," Eleanor said coldly. "Did you need him?" I wanted to ask about the seating arrangements for lunch," Beatrice lied. Eleanor knew it was a lie because Beatrice's left hand was clenching her skirt, a nervous tic she had had since childhood. "Beatrice," Eleanor stepped closer. "Is that my sapphire brooch?" Beatrice froze, her hand flying to her throat. Pinned to her lace collar was the sterling sapphire, a family heirloom meant to be worn by the bride on her wedding day. I was just trying it on," Beatrice stammered, her eyes watering. "To see if it was polished enough for you, Eleanor. I wanted everything to be perfect." "Take it off," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, please, I didn't mean. Take it off." Beatrice unpinned the brooch with trembling fingers and handed it over. "You've been so snappy lately, Eleanor. It's the wedding nerves. You really should lie down. You look haggard." "Thank you for your concern, cousin," Eleanor said, clutching the brooch so tightly the pin dug into her palm. "I will rest when the work is done." Beatrice turned and fled the room. Silas stepped out of the shadows. "She's not just a pawn, Eleanor. She's auditioning for your life. She was wearing that brooch because she thinks she's already the mistress of this house." "She will never be mistress of this house," Eleanor whispered, pinning the brooch to her own dress. "Tonight is the rehearsal dinner. We need to be careful. Arthur will be drinking. When he drinks, he gets careless. But he also gets violent." "I'll be there," Silas said. "Hidden in plain sight." "No," Eleanor turned to him. "You can't be a clerk at the dinner. You need to be a guest. Can you pull that off without Arthur throwing you out?" Silas grinned. It was a wolfish grin that made him look strikingly like his brother, yet entirely different. "I received an invitation, Eleanor. As the Duke's brother, I am technically the best man, though he hasn't spoken to me in 5 years. If I show up, he can't cause a scene without ruining his perfect gentleman facade in front of the bishop." "Then we dance," Eleanor said, "and we wait for him to slip." The great hall of Sterling Manor was transformed. Garlands of autumn ivy and white roses draped the chandeliers. 300 guests, the cream of British aristocracy, milled about, sipping champagne and whispering behind fans. Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase. She had chosen a dress of deep crimson silk, a stark contrast to the virginal white expected of a bride-to-be. It was a statement. It was the color of war. "She looks like a queen," a voice murmured near the orchestra pit. "She looks like she's about to order an execution," another replied. Arthur waited at the bottom of the stairs. He looked magnificent in his dress uniform, medals gleaming under the gaslights. But his eyes were tight. "Crimson, Eleanor," he hissed as she took his arm. "A bit bold for a rehearsal, isn't it?" "I felt festive, Arthur," she beamed, waving to the Earl of Holloway. "Besides, white is for tomorrow. Tonight we celebrate passion." Arthur smirked, his ego stroked. "Passion. I like the sound of that." The dinner was an endurance test. Eleanor sat between Arthur and the bishop, making polite conversation about charity work and the weather, while under the table her hands were clenched into fists. She watched Beatrice, who was seated at the far end of the table, drinking wine rapidly and glaring at Eleanor with undisguised envy. Then the doors opened. A hush fell over the room. Walking in, unannounced, wearing a suit that was slightly out of fashion, but impeccably tailored, was Lord Silas Blackwood. Arthur dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the fine china. "Good evening," Silas announced, his voice carrying effortlessly to the high rafters. "I hope I'm not late. The trains from London are notoriously unreliable." Arthur stood up, his face purple. "Silas, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to support my brother," Silas said, walking toward the head table. He picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "And to meet the woman brave enough to marry him." He turned his dark eyes to Eleanor. For a second, the rest of the room vanished. Eleanor felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the plan and everything to do with the man standing before her. "Lady Eleanor," Silas bowed low. "You are more radiant than the descriptions." "Lord Silas," Eleanor replied, playing her part. "Arthur has told me so little about you." "I am the family disappointment," Silas toasted. "Every family has one." "Get out," Arthur growled. Now, Your Grace," the bishop interjected, sensing tension. "It is a time for forgiveness. Brothers reunited on the eve of a sacrament. It is a sign from God." Arthur was trapped. He couldn't throw his brother out without offending the bishop. He ground his teeth and sat down. "Sit, Silas. But if you say one word about politics, I'll have the footman remove you." The dinner continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Silas dominated the conversation, charming the older ladies with legal anecdotes and making the men laugh with dry wit. He was everything Arthur was not: genuine, sharp, and charismatic. Arthur stewed in silence, drinking glass after glass of heavy port. When the music started, Arthur stood up to claim the first dance with Eleanor. He gripped her waist too tightly. "Did you invite him?" Arthur whispered in her ear as they spun. "Me? Why would I invite a man I've never met?" Eleanor lied smoothly. "Perhaps he came for money." "He always comes for money," Arthur spat. "I'll deal with him later." "Arthur, you're hurting me," Eleanor said, pulling back. "You're mine, Eleanor," Arthur said, his eyes glassy with drink and malice. "Don't forget that. Tomorrow, you belong to me. Body, soul, and bank account." He dipped her, aggressive and clumsy. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. "May I cut in?" Silas was there. He didn't wait for permission. He tapped Arthur's shoulder with firm authority. Arthur glared but released her, stumbling slightly as he walked toward the bar. Silas took Eleanor into his arms. The difference was instant. His hold was firm but respectful, his guidance on the dance floor fluid. "He's drunk," Silas murmured, keeping a polite smile for the onlookers. "He's dangerous," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice low. "Did you see Beatrice? She left the table 10 minutes ago." "I saw," Silas said, spinning her near the terrace doors. "My associate Mr. Thorne is following her." "Thorne is following Beatrice?" "Thorne is surprisingly light on his feet for a man of 60, Silas said. "We think she's going to the old Earl's chambers." Eleanor missed a step. "My father? Why?" "Arthur wants the Earl gone," Silas said grimly. "If he dies before the wedding, the estate enters probate. It complicates things, but Arthur might think it simplifies them. No father to object, no guardian to sign counterclaims." "I have to go to him," Eleanor said, panic rising. "Not yet," Silas held her tight. "If you run out now, you cause a scene. Arthur is watching us. Look." Eleanor glanced over Silas's shoulder. Arthur was leaning against a pillar, watching them with narrowed, predatory eyes. "Finish the dance," Silas commanded softly. "Trust me, Eleanor. Thorne will stop her." They danced. For 3 minutes, Eleanor felt safe in the arms of the enemy's brother. She realized with a start that she wasn't just fighting for her estate anymore. She was fighting for a future where men like Arthur didn't win. And perhaps a future where men like Silas existed. The music ended. Silas bowed. "Thank you, my lady," Eleanor curtsied. "Lord Silas." She turned and walked calmly toward the exit, smiling at guests, accepting compliments. As soon as she was out of the great hall, she hiked up her crimson skirts and ran. She took the servants' stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Her breath tore at her lungs. "Please, let him be safe. Please." She reached her father's wing. The door to his room was ajar. "No!" she gasped. She burst into the room. The fire was low. In the wheelchair by the window, her father sat, his head lolling to the side. Standing over him was Beatrice. She held a small vial of clear liquid. "Beatrice!" Eleanor screamed. Beatrice spun around, dropping the vial. It shattered on the floor. "Eleanor, I was just giving him his tonic." "That wasn't his tonic." A voice came from the shadows. Mr. Thorne stepped out from behind the velvet curtains, holding a handkerchief over his nose. It smelled distinctly of laudanum, a lethal dose for a man in his condition. Beatrice's face crumpled. "No. Arthur said it would just make him sleep through the wedding. He said the Earl gets agitated in crowds." "You fool," Eleanor hissed, rushing to her father. She checked his pulse. It was weak, thready. But there, he was breathing. Arthur told you to kill him. Beatrice fell to her knees, sobbing. He promised me. He promised we would go to Paris. He promised you nothing but a noose, Silas said, appearing in the doorway behind Eleanor. He had followed her. What do we do? Eleanor looked up at Silas, tears finally spilling over. We can't have a wedding if the Earl is like this. Silas looked at the shattered vial, then at the weeping Beatrice, and finally at the unconscious Earl. We don't cancel, Silas said, his voice hard as iron. We escalate. He's unconscious, Silas. Then we wake him up, Silas said, or we prop him up. But the Earl will attend that wedding. And Beatrice? Beatrice looked up, mascara running down her face. Beatrice is going to remain in this room, Silas said, guarded by Thorn, until we need her testimony. Testimony? Beatrice whispered. Oh, yes. Eleanor stood up, wiping her tears. The sadness was gone. Only the rage remained. You wanted a part in the wedding, cousin? You're going to get one. You're going to be the surprise witness. The morning of October 16th dawned cold and grey. Fog rolled off the moors, shrouding Stirling Manor in a ghostly white mist. Inside the bride's chambers, the atmosphere was funereal. Mrs. Gable laced Eleanor into her corset with grim determination. Tighter, Eleanor ordered. My lady, you won't be able to breathe, Mrs. Gable protested. I don't need to breathe, Eleanor said, staring at her reflection. I need to be armoured. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of Chantilly lace and seed pearls, costing a fortune. As Eleanor stepped into it, she felt like she was stepping into a coffin. But this coffin was a trap for someone else. There was a knock at the door. Lady Eleanor. It's time. Eleanor put on her veil. It was thick, obscuring her face. Let's go. Downstairs, the house was in chaos. Carriages were lining up. Guests were being ferried to the family chapel on the estate grounds. Eleanor walked into the library where Silas was waiting. He looked tired. He hadn't slept. How is he? Eleanor asked. Groggy, Silas said, but awake. The doctor gave him a stimulant. He knows who you are, but he can't speak much. Does he know about Arthur? I told him, Silas said. He cried, but he agreed to the plan. Eleanor nodded. She felt a profound sadness for her father, a man who had been manipulated in his frailty. Arthur will pay for that, for making him feel weak. The carriage is ready, Silas said. He offered her his arm. Are you afraid? Terrified, Eleanor admitted. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. The ride to the chapel was silent. Through the window, Eleanor saw the villagers lining the road, waving handkerchiefs. They thought this was a fairy tale. They had no idea they were watching a tragedy unfold. The chapel was ancient, built of grey stone that smelled of damp earth and incense. It was packed. 400 people turned to watch as the organ roared to life. Arthur stood at the altar. He looked hungover, his eyes bloodshot, but he stood tall, the picture of aristocratic arrogance. He smiled as he saw Eleanor enter. It was a smile of ownership. Eleanor walked down the aisle alone. Her father was already seated at the front, propped up in his wheelchair, flanked by 2 large footmen who looked more like guards than servants. As she reached the altar, Arthur leaned in. You look expensive, Eleanor. I like it. I am expensive, Arthur, she whispered back behind her veil. You have no idea. The priest, an old man with failing eyesight, began the service. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Eleanor tuned him out. She was counting seconds. 1, 2, 3. She looked up at the choir loft. She saw a glimmer of glass. The slide projector was ready. If any man can show just cause, why they may not lawfully be joined together. Let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. Silence that followed was heavy. Usually, this was the part where everyone held their breath for a second before relaxing. Arthur smirked. He looked at the congregation, daring anyone to speak. I object. The voice was weak, trembling, but it cut through the silence like a whip. Arthur froze. The entire congregation gasped. Heads turned. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't a lover. It was the Earl of Sterling. He pushed himself up in his wheelchair, his knuckles white. "Father," Eleanor said, playing her part perfectly. "What is it?" "This man," the Earl rasped, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "This man is a thief." "He's delirious," Arthur shouted, his charm vanishing instantly. "Someone get him water. He's having an episode." "I am not delirious," the Earl said, his voice gaining strength from pure anger. "I am awake." "Sit down, old man," Arthur hissed, stepping toward him. "Don't ruin your daughter's day." "He isn't ruining it, Arthur," Eleanor said, lifting her veil. Her face was stone cold. "He's saving it." Arthur looked at her, confused. "What?" "Silas," Eleanor said clearly. "Now." From the choir loft, a beam of light cut through the gloom. It hit the white stone wall behind the altar. It wasn't a hymn lyric. It was a photograph, a lantern slide, developed hastily overnight. The image was grainy, but undeniable. It showed a document. A letter in Arthur's distinct handwriting, addressed to a loan shark in the East End. Once the old fool is dead and the daughter is secured, the Sterling assets will cover the gambling debts. I estimate liquidation within 3 months. The crowd erupted. Ladies shrieked. Men stood up, shouting. "What is this?" Arthur screamed, spinning around to look at the projection. "That's a forgery." "Is it?" Silas walked out from the vestry, holding the original letter. "I found this in your desk, Arthur, along with the poison you gave to Beatrice." "Beatrice?" Arthur looked around frantically. "Where is she? She'll tell you. She'll tell you I love her." "Beatrice is indisposed," Silas said calmly, walking up the altar steps. "She's currently giving a statement to the local constable about attempted murder. Yours." Arthur backed away, his face draining of colour. He looked at the exits, blocked by the footman. He looked at the guests. They were looking at him with horror and disgust. "Eleanor," Arthur pleaded, switching tactics instantly. "Eleanor, darling, listen to me. It's a misunderstanding. Silas is jealous. He wants you for himself." Eleanor stepped forward. She looked at the man she had almost married. The man who had kissed her cousin. The man who had tried to kill her father. "Arthur," she said, her voice projecting to the back of the church. "You wanted a perfect wedding. You wanted a spectacle. Well, look around." She gestured to the screaming crowd, the flashing bulbs of the press photographers who had been tipped off by Thorne, and the constable now entering the back of the church. "I gave you exactly what you wanted," Eleanor smiled. "A day everyone will remember." Arthur snarled. He lunged at her, but he never reached her. Silas stepped in, his fist connecting squarely with Arthur's jaw. The Duke of Blackwood went down in a heap of satin and shame. But the story wasn't over. As the constable dragged Arthur away, shouting threats, Eleanor felt a strange sensation. She looked at Silas, who was nursing his bruised hand. "Is it done?" she asked. "The wedding is over," Silas said. "The war is won." "Not quite," Eleanor said, looking at the stunned congregation. "I still have a reception to host, and I believe I am short a groom." She looked at Silas. The guests looked at Silas. Silas looked at Eleanor. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, terrifying clarity. He realized, standing there in the ruins of the ceremony, that he didn't want to leave. Lady Eleanor, Silas said quietly, I believe there is a clause in the Sterling Charter. If the groom is found to be a criminal, the betrothal can be transferred to the next available kin, providing the bride consents. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Are you proposing, Lord Silas? Here, over your brother's unconscious body? I'm a pragmatist, Silas shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips, and I hate to see a good party go to waste. But before Eleanor could answer, the church doors banged open again. A breathless messenger boy ran in, waving a telegram. My lady, my lady. What now? Eleanor sighed. It's from the Bank of London, the boy gasped. The transfer, the deed Arthur signed yesterday. What about it? Thorne stepped forward. It triggered a default, the boy stammered. Because Arthur moved the Scottish lands, his other creditors called in their loans immediately. The Blackwood estate. It's been seized by the Crown. 10 minutes ago. Silence fell over the church again. Silas started to laugh. It was a rich, genuine sound. He's not just arrested, Eleanor. He is penniless. He doesn't even have the money to hire a barrister. Eleanor looked at the projection still shining on the wall, the evidence of her victory. Well, she smoothed her dress. Mrs. Gable, tell the kitchen to serve the soup. It seems we have a victory to celebrate. She took Silas's arm. Walk me out, my lord. We have much to discuss. Like what? Silas asked as they walked down the aisle, past the stunned onlookers. Like the fact that you punched a duke in a church, Eleanor whispered, and the fact that I think I might actually love you. Let's start with the punch, Silas grinned. It's less complicated. The scandal of the Sterling wedding did not fade. It fermented. For weeks, the newspapers in London spoke of nothing else. They called Eleanor the Iron Bride and the Lady of the Ledger. Arthur sat in a holding cell in Newgate Prison, awaiting trial for fraud and attempted murder. The mighty Duke of Blackwood, stripped of his velvet and his valets, looked remarkably small in the damp grey light of incarceration. Eleanor did not go to see him. She had nothing to say to Arthur that the law wouldn't say for her. Instead, she went to see Beatrice. The women's remand centre was cold, smelling of lye soap and misery. Beatrice sat on a narrow cot, her once pristine blonde hair matted, her eyes red-rimmed. When Eleanor entered, accompanied by Mr. Thorne, Beatrice didn't even look up. You won, Beatrice whispered into her lap. Are you happy? Happiness has nothing to do with it, Eleanor said, signalling for the guard to leave them. She remained standing, her silhouette sharp against the barred window. I came to ask why. Not why you wanted the money. I understand greed. But why did you want to kill my father? He took you in when your parents died. He treated you like a daughter. Beatrice looked up then, and the expression on her face was ugly. It was a mask of pure, curdled resentment. Like a daughter. Beatrice let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. He treated me like a pet, Eleanor. A charity case. It was always Eleanor is so smart. Eleanor is so capable. Beatrice, go arrange the flowers. I was the poor cousin, the shadow. Arthur saw me. He told me I was beautiful. He told me I deserved to be a duchess, not a dependent. He lied to you, Eleanor said simply. He saw a weakness he could exploit. He didn't love you, Beatrice. He used you to get the key to the medicine cabinet. He did love me, Beatrice screamed, standing up. He's going to fix this. His lawyers will— Arthur has no lawyers, Mr. Thorne interjected softly. He has a court-appointed barrister who is currently trying to convince him to plead insanity. Arthur is trying to pin the entire poisoning plot on you, Miss Beatrice. He claims he had no knowledge of the laudanum. He claims you acted alone to remove the Earl so you could marry him sooner." Beatrice froze. The blood drained from her face. He said that." "We have the deposition." Thorne pulled a paper from his briefcase. "He calls you a deranged, obsessed woman who seduced him and threatened him." Eleanor watched her cousin break. It wasn't a sudden snap, but a slow crumbling. Beatrice sank back onto the cot, covering her face with her hands. The illusion of romance, the fantasy she had destroyed her family for, dissolved into dust. "I will testify," Beatrice whispered through her fingers. "I will tell them everything. Where he bought the poison, where he hid the forged deeds. Everything." Eleanor nodded. She felt no triumph, only a hollow exhaustion. "Good. That is the only way you will avoid the hangman, Beatrice. I can perhaps advocate for exile instead of execution. But you will never set foot in Sterling Manor again." Eleanor turned to leave. "Eleanor," Beatrice called out, her voice small. "Do you hate me?" Eleanor paused at the iron door. She thought about the childhood games they had played in the garden. She thought of the betrayal in the library. "I don't hate you," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I pity you. You traded a family who loved you for a man who couldn't even remember your eye color during his interrogation." The heavy door clanged shut, sealing the past behind her. Outside, Silas was waiting in the carriage. The winter snow had started to fall, dusting the cobblestones of London with white. "How was it?" Silas asked, handing her a heated brick wrapped in flannel to warm her hands. "Tragic," Eleanor said, leaning back against the squabs. "She will testify against him." "Then it's over," Silas said. "The Crown will seize the Blackwood title. Arthur will likely be transported to the colonies or imprisoned for life. The Sterling estate is safe." "Is it?" Eleanor looked at him. "The legal fees, the cancelled contracts, the scandal. We are safe from Arthur. But the coffers are empty, Silas. I spent the last of the liquid assets on the wedding preparations that went to waste." Silas looked out the window. "Not entirely to waste. The food was donated to the orphanage. The flowers were sent to the hospital. And you managed to rid yourself of a murderer." "And what about you?" Eleanor asked. "You put your own career on hold to help me. You forged documents. You punched a duke. You are implicated in this mess." "I have been called worse things than an accomplice," Silas shrugged. "Besides, I find the country air agrees with me. London is too crowded." There was a silence between them, filled with things unsaid. Since the wedding, Silas had stayed at Sterling Manor, ostensibly to handle the legal fallout. He worked in the office next to hers. They ate dinner together every night with the recovering Earl. They had become a team, a machine of efficiency and wit. But they hadn't spoken of the moment in the church, the almost proposal. "Eleanor," Silas said, turning to her. His dark eyes were serious. "There is a solution to the financial issue. The Blackwood lands in Scotland, the ones Arthur transferred to the trust." "Yes." "The trust is valid," Silas said. "Because Arthur signed it before he was charged with a crime, and because it was a gift rather than a transaction, the Crown cannot seize it as part of his personal assets. It belongs to the trustee." "You," Eleanor realized. "And the beneficiary," Silas corrected, "which is the future issue of the Sterling line. Technically, that land, and the timber revenues associated with it, which are substantial, belongs to your future children." Eleanor blushed, a rare occurrence. "I see. So we have a trust fund for children who do not exist?" "We could fix that," Silas said. His voice was rough, uncertain for the first time. "The existence part. Eventually. Eleanor looked at him. She saw the man who had stood by her in the rain, the man who had believed her when she was surrounded by lies. "Are you proposing again, Silas?" she asked softly. "Without the adrenaline of a fistfight this time?" "I am." Silas reached across the carriage and took her hand. His grip was warm, solid. "I am not a duke. I am a disgraced barrister with a penchant for bending the rules. But I admire you, Eleanor. More than that. You are the most formidable woman I have ever met. I would very much like to spend the rest of my life watching you organize the world." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I don't need a duke, Silas. I realized that the moment I opened the library door, I need a partner." She leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't the tentative, polite kiss she had shared with Arthur. It was deliberate. It was passionate. It was a seal on a new contract, one based on truth. Sterling Manor was alive. It wasn't the stiff, formal atmosphere of the wedding that never was. This was a chaotic, joyous life. The great hall was decked with holly and ivy. A massive fire roared in the hearth. Eleanor sat at her desk, but she wasn't alone. A cradle sat by her feet. Inside, sleeping soundly, was Arthur. No, William Sterling Blackwood. She had refused to name him after his uncle. "Is the timber contract signed?" Silas asked, walking in with snow on his boots. He looked healthier, happier. The shadows under his eyes were gone, replaced by laugh lines. "Signed and filed," Eleanor said, putting down her pen. "We are in the black, Silas. For the first time in 20 years, the estate is fully solvent." "Remind me to give myself a raise," Silas grinned, leaning down to kiss the top of her head, then checking on his son. "He's sleeping? A miracle." "He has your temperament," Eleanor teased. "Stubborn." "He has your eyes," Silas countered. "Calculating." The door opened, and the Earl of Sterling wheeled himself in. He was frail, but his mind was sharp again. He had spent the last year recovering, finding joy in his grandson. "The guests are arriving," the Earl said. "And this time, Eleanor, I checked the guest list personally. No villains allowed." Eleanor laughed. "Thank you, Father." The villains were long gone. Arthur had been sentenced to 20 years in a penal colony in Australia. Reports said he was working on a chain gang, breaking rocks. It was a fitting end for a man who tried to break people. Beatrice had been granted leniency for her testimony. She was living in a convent in France, teaching English to orphans. She wrote letters occasionally, asking for forgiveness. Eleanor read them, filed them, but never replied. Forgiveness was a heavy ledger, and she wasn't ready to balance it yet. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her dress. It was emerald green velvet. She never wore white anymore. "Are you ready?" Silas asked, offering his arm. "For the party?" Eleanor asked. "For life," Silas said. They walked out into the great hall together. The room was filled with friends, tenants, and neighbors. There was no pretension. No one was there to network or scheme. They were there to celebrate the christening of the heir and the first anniversary of Eleanor and Silas, who had married quietly, with only the Earl and Mrs. Gable as witnesses, a week after Arthur's trial. As the music started, a lively reel, not a stately waltz, Eleanor looked around the room. She saw Mrs. Gable drinking punch. She saw Mr. Thorne dancing with a village widow. She saw her father smiling. She thought back to that day in the library, the moment her heart had shattered. She realized now that the shattering was necessary. It had broken the glass cage she had built around herself. It had forced her to stop planning for a perfect image and start fighting for a real life. Silas spun her onto the floor. "What are you thinking about?" "I was thinking," Eleanor smiled, looking up at her husband, that I really must organize a better filing system for the nursery." Silas threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing off the rafters. "Never change, Eleanor. Never change." They danced into the night, spinning faster and faster. Outside, the snow covered the tracks of the past, leaving the world clean, white, and ready for a new story to be written. This wasn't the perfect wedding Eleanor had planned. It was messy, it was loud, and it was born from scandal. But as she looked at the man she loved, and the home she had saved, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. It was perfect. And so, Lady Eleanor Sterling didn't just survive the betrayal, she weaponized it. She taught us that when life, or a deceitful duke, tries to steal your future, you don't just cry. You check the ledgers, you find the loopholes, and you take back what's yours. Arthur Blackwood thought he was marrying a passive victim, but he found himself at war with a mastermind. In the end, true love wasn't found in a perfect ceremony, but in the trenches of a shared battle. Eleanor and Silas proved that the strongest vows aren't the ones made in a church, but the ones made when the world is falling apart. What would you have done if you were Eleanor? Would you have exposed them at the altar or plotted a darker revenge? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and romance, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your ledgers balanced.